You know, Spain's relationship with its Jewish past is, well, it's a story packed with contradictions. It's a land that's haunted by a golden age it helped destroy, a culture it tried to systematically erase, and a people it can't seem to fully forget or truly welcome home. Okay, let's dive into this really complex and fascinating history. For centuries, Spain has been trapped in this really strange loop. On the one hand, it tries to erase its Jewish history, pretend it never happened. But then, whenever it's politically convenient, it yanks it right back out and uses it for its own game. The Sephardim, that's the descendants of Spain's Jews, they're the ghosts caught right in the middle of this very cynical game. So, who are these ghosts really? To get it, to really understand their story, we have to go back. I mean, way, way back. This isn't some recent thing. It's a haunting that has echoed through the centuries. We're talking about a Jewish presence in Spain that goes all the way back to the Roman Empire. And the first definitive proof we have, it's actually this tiny, kind of heartbreaking piece of evidence. It's the tombstone of a little Jewish girl named Anya Salomonula. It was found in Almeria, and it dates to the 2nd century. That's just how deep these roots go. Okay, so this brings us to the first huge chapter in this story, a period of unbelievable flourishing for Jewish life, which was then followed by one of the most catastrophic betrayals in all of European history. So picture this. Under Muslim rule in Al-Andalus, Jewish communities were technically second-class citizens, sure, but they became absolutely indispensable. Why? Well, their religion required universal literacy, which meant they were the scholars, the doctors, the diplomats, the administrators. While the Christian kingdoms up north were mostly illiterate, cities like Almeria were these economic powerhouses, total engines of global trade, and they were driven by their Jewish communities. Now, was it a perfect utopia? No, definitely not. Some fundamentalist dynasties like the Almohads persecuted them, but for a good while, it was a genuine golden age of culture and commerce. They were, in so many ways, the engine of what was probably the most advanced society in Europe at the time. You know, the story of the great philosopher Maimonides perfectly captures both the peak of that era and the danger that was always there. He was one of the greatest minds of his time, a total product of Al-Andalus. But even he was forced to flee persecution by fundamentalist dynasties. His story is a stark reminder that even at the height of the Golden Age, survival was never, ever guaranteed. All right, so to really crack this mystery open, we have to start by taking apart the official story Spain told itself for centuries. And this story, it was absolutely crucial for them to justify the expulsion in the first place. And here's where it gets really interesting. You see the nationalist myth, the official propaganda, right? It paints this clean, simple fantasy of a heroic Christian Reconquista. But the reality? Oh man, the historical reality was messy. It was complicated, full of cooperation and strange alliances between Christian and Muslim kingdoms that completely, totally undermine that tidy little myth. And this wasn't just some abstract idea, we're talking about real concrete examples here. You have a Christian princess from Navarre marrying the Muslim ruler of Cordoba. You've got communities in places like Valencia where Christians, Muslims, and Jews were all living together, relatively peacefully under Christian rule. And here's the kicker. While a lot of Christian Spain was largely illiterate, the Jewish communities of Al-Andalus were these cosmopolitan hubs of learning and commerce. They were the engine in many ways. Okay, so the official history is a myth. We get that. But can we prove it? Is there any hard scientific evidence of this buried, intertwined past that's written into the Spanish people themselves? Well, the answer is a resounding yes. And this is where science just comes in and completely demolishes the myth. Modern genetic studies of people in Spain and Portugal show significant North African and Jewish ancestry. It totally debunks the fantasy of some pure Catholic bloodline. The very history they tried to erase is literally in their DNA. And here's the thing. This haunted history, it isn't even history. The exact same contradictions are playing out right now, today, as a bitter political football in modern Spain. You can basically see the whole battle laid out right here. The memory of that multicultural medieval Spain, Al-Andalus, is now primarily kept alive by the political left. Meanwhile, the right is basically continuing that old fascist project of trying to erase it.
focusing only on the Catholic conquest. The battle lines are crystal clear.
But even during this golden age, a much darker story was being woven right into the fabric of Spanish identity. And it is perfectly captured in a famous story about Spain's great national hero, El Cid. So the story goes that El Cid needed cash, so he went to some Jewish moneylenders and gave them a locked chest, supposedly full of gold, as collateral for a loan. Except it was filled with sand. And here's the wild part. This wasn't seen as some shameful act of fraud. No, it became a celebrated tale of Christian cleverness outsmarting this supposedly greedy Jew. And what's truly unbelievable is that this exact chest, the symbol of a con job that's rooted in an anti-Semitic stereotype, is still on display today. It's presented as a national treasure inside the Burgos Cathedral. Think about that, a monument to a swindle sitting in a cathedral. This wasn't some sudden storm that came out of nowhere. No, this was a climate of intolerance that had been building for centuries. Just look at this timeline. You can see this really troubling pattern emerging. It starts out in the 4th century with social rules, things like banning Christians and Jews from even marrying. But by 418, it escalates to actual mob violence. And then, under the Visigothic kings, it becomes official state policy. We're talking forced conversions, stripping people of their basic civil rights. A very dark precedent was being set. So when Muslim rule arrives in 711, it wasn't a permanent solution, but it was, at least for a while, a break from this escalating persecution.
But that stability was completely shattered with the arrival of more fundamentalist groups from North Africa, especially the Almohads. They came in and just threw out the old system. The choice became brutal and simple: convert to Islam or get out.
The result? It was an absolute catastrophe for Al-Andalus. You had this mass exodus of the Jewish community, which included some of the most brilliant minds of the day: scholars, doctors, merchants. By forcing out such a vital part of their society, the rulers basically just hollowed out their own kingdom. It triggered this decline that they never really recovered from. And it's the first time we see this pattern: intolerance leading to a massive self-inflicted wound. This forced countless Jewish families to flee north into the Christian kingdoms. And this is where things get really, really tense. In Christian Spain, the Jews found a very precarious kind of safety. On the one hand, the monarchs protected them. They valued them as doctors, financiers, and scholars. But on the other hand, the general population, they resented them. This was fueled by religious hostility and, frankly, the need for a scapegoat during a century of plague, famine, and war. You've got this society on a knife's edge. It was a social tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. And that spark, it wasn't an event. It was a person, one single, relentlessly hateful man. His name was Ferran Martínez. And for 15 years, think about that, a decade and a half, he stood in his pulpit in Seville and delivered sermon after sermon after sermon, blaming the Jews for every single problem in the kingdom. And he wasn't subtle. He was openly inciting the public to go out and destroy their synagogues. For years, the only things really holding him in check were the king and the archbishop. They actually ordered him to stop his hate-filled preaching, repeatedly. But then came the fateful year of 1390. In a stroke of terrible luck, both the king and the archbishop died. This left a total power vacuum, with an 11-year-old boy on the throne. And Martínez, well, he saw his chance, and he ruthlessly exploited it. So, the hatred had been carefully cultivated for years. Next, we see the explosion. The day it all went down was June 6, 1391. Whipped into a frenzy by Martínez's sermons, a massive mob descended on the Jewish quarter of Seville, and the city just erupted into flames. What followed was an absolute massacre. We're talking thousands murdered in the streets. Homes and businesses were looted, synagogues were burned to the ground. And for the survivors, huddled together in terror, there was only one terrible choice: convert to Christianity, right there on the spot, or die. And this horror didn't stop in Seville. No, it spread like wildfire. In June, it tore through the south. By July, it had raced north into central Spain, engulfing cities like Toledo. And by August, it leaped to the coast, hitting huge centers like Valencia and Barcelona. In just 3 months, Jewish life across the entire Iberian Peninsula was completely shuttered. But here's the twist. This wave of unbelievable violence didn't solve the Jewish problem in the eyes of Spanish society. Not at all. In fact, it created an entirely new one. The sheer scale of what happened next is hard to wrap your head around. In order to survive these massacres, tens of thousands of Jews were forcibly baptized. This single act fundamentally changed the religious landscape of Spain practically overnight. And just like that, a new, distinct social class was created, the conversos, which literally means the converted or new Christians. But their conversion, done at the point of a sword, was immediately suspect. The old Christians were convinced that many of them were secretly practicing their old faith, a heresy that became known as crypto-Judaism. And this suspicion, this poison, would just fester for decades. And this is where the Spanish Inquisition finally enters the story. It was established in 1478 with one primary mission: to root out heresy among the conversos and enforce what they called true Catholic orthodoxy. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't even founded until 1478. That's nearly 4 decades after the pogroms of 1391. You see, it wasn't the cause of the massacres. It was a response to their consequences, much, much later. And this brings us to a crucial legal distinction, the detail that changes everything. As a church court, an ecclesiastical court, the Inquisition had zero jurisdiction over non-Christians. It legally could not prosecute Jews. Its true target, its primary target, was the conversos. Why? Because as baptized Christians, they could be investigated and they could be punished for the heresy of secretly practicing Judaism. So let's just lay out the chain of events here, step by step. First, the mob violence of 1391 erupts. This leads to mass forced conversions, which in turn creates this huge new converso population. Widespread suspicion that these new Christians are secret heretics then festers for decades, until finally the Inquisition is founded for one specific purpose: to police them. But its methods? Well, they led to a chillingly logical conclusion. The first Grand Inquisitor, a guy named Tomás de Torquemada, laid out this terrifyingly simple argument. It goes something like this. Step 1. Our goal is to purify the faith of the conversos. Okay. Step 2, he argues. Contact with their practicing Jewish friends, family, and rabbis is a source of infection, causing them to backslide. Step 3. To make sure the converts are pure, you have to eliminate that contact, which leads to the horrifying Step 4. Therefore, all practicing Jews must be removed from Spain. And with Torquemada breathing down their necks, the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, they agreed. As soon as Granada, the last Muslim stronghold, fell, the Catholic monarchs issued the Edict of Expulsion. Spain's Jews had a choice: convert to Christianity or get out, forever. This kicked off what you could really call a cultural genocide, and it was enforced by the infamous Spanish Inquisition. And this led to a really toxic and pivotal idea, limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood. With this concept, antisemitism wasn't just about religion anymore. It became racial. It didn't matter if you were a devout Christian. If you had Jewish ancestry, you were considered permanently stained, impure. And this idea would go on to haunt Spain for centuries. The trauma of that expulsion is so profound that even today, more than 500 years later, some Sephardic families still hold on to the keys to the homes in Spain they were forced to abandon. It's this tangible symbol of a connection that was never, ever truly broken. So what happened? A massive diaspora. The Sephardic Jews, that's what we call the Jews of Spain, were forced to scatter. They went everywhere: the Ottoman Empire, North Africa, all over Europe. But what's absolutely incredible is that they held on to their unique Spanish culture. They even preserved their language, Ladino, which is basically 15th century Spanish, for the next 500 years. Just think about that. And this idea would go on to haunt Spain for centuries. You see, once you build this giant machine of paranoia, it needs a target. After the Jews were expelled, the state needed a new enemy from within to justify its existence. You can literally watch the mission creep over the centuries. After the conversos, the Inquisition went after the tiny number of Protestants in Spain. Then it was the Moriscos, the converted Muslims, who were all expelled in 1609. By the 18th century, it was hunting down Freemasons and Enlightenment thinkers. It was a machine that simply had to keep running. And it ran for a very, very long time. The Spanish Inquisition wasn't officially shut down until 1834. That's more than 3.5 centuries of terror. Let that sink in for a moment. So, what is anti-Masonry anyway?
Well, it's a worldwide thing, but its historical powerhouse, the institution that gave it real teeth, was undeniably the Catholic Church. The Church's opposition created a kind of intellectual and spiritual doctrine that would last for centuries and spread across the entire globe.
And here it is, the moment it all became official. In 1738, Pope Clement XII issues a papal bull, that's a superformal decree, called In Eminenti, and the ruling was absolute. Every single Freemason was excommunicated from the church. Boom. Just like that, an unwavering foundational doctrine of opposition was born, and it found incredibly fertile ground in deeply Catholic nations like Spain.
Now, what's really fascinating is how this original religious hostility got adapted. It's like a political virus. The idea was so potent that it was picked up and mutated by completely different movements. Fascist regimes repurposed it to be about a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. Even some far-left movements later framed the Masons as a tool for capitalist elites. The core idea was just too useful to let go of. But it was really in Spain where this conflict became a raging fire. This is where the abstract battle of ideas became a very real, very bloody political war, a fight over the future of the nation itself.
Okay, so here's the pivotal moment. In 1812, Spanish liberals, a lot of whom were Masons, draft Spain's very first democratic constitution, nicknamed La Pepa. They're fighting for their king against Napoleon. But when the king, Ferdinand VII, comes back in 1814, he betrays them. He completely tears up the constitution and launches a brutal persecution against liberals, forever fusing anti-Masonry with Spanish nationalism. This all culminates centuries later under Franco's dictatorship, which systematically hunted down and killed Masons. So, after all that, what was the real price? What was the true cost of this centuries-long quest for so-called purity? What did Spain actually lose when it purged its own people? The trade-off was just brutal. Sure, in the short term, there was a flood of wealth from the Americas and this sense of a unified nation, but the long-term rot was catastrophic. By kicking out its most educated and entrepreneurial minorities, Spain basically sentenced itself to centuries of economic stagnation.
By the 20th century, the country was plagued by illiteracy, massive inequality, and was decades behind its neighbors technologically.
It was the exact same tragic pattern we saw before, just plan out all over again. The intolerance that brought down Islamic Spain now led Christian Spain right down the same path. By choosing purity over pluralism, Spain fell into a deep, long sleep, becoming a shadow of its former glorious self.
So, in the early 1900s, some Spanish intellectuals are traveling abroad, and they stumble upon these communities still speaking 15th century Spanish, and they are just stunned. This discovery leads to a movement called Sephardismo, a kind of supposed friendship with Sephardic Jews. But make no mistake,
Yeah, this wasn't really about making amends for a massive historical injustice. It was a pragmatic, almost cold-blooded plan. Progressive figures like this Dr. Polito saw these wealthy, influential Sephardic communities around the world and basically thought, hey, we can use their economic power to help modernize Spain. And as you can probably imagine, this idea was not popular with everyone. In fact, it faced fierce opposition from some of Spain's most powerful institutions. The Catholic Church, which was deeply anti-Semitic, saw it as a major threat. So did nationalist groups like the National Anti-Masonic and Anti-Semitic League, who were convinced this was all just some kind of Jewish plot to undermine Spain. But here's an absolutely incredible irony. While this whole debate was raging on the mainland, a real safe haven was forming right under the Spanish flag. In the cities of Ceuta and Melilla in North Africa, Jews who were fleeing persecution in Morocco found safety. And many of them even got Spanish citizenship. It was this little pocket of tolerance that was the total opposite of what was about to happen back in Spain. And this is where the story takes a truly tragic and grotesque turn. That very same progressive group that was championing this reconnection, the ILE, would later be hunted down and destroyed by Franco's fascists, who accused them of being part of the exact Judeo-Masonic conspiracy the old guard was so afraid of. The irony is just staggering. And this brings us right into the 20th century and the fascist dictator Francisco Franco. His regime would take this long history of cynicism and turn it into a political art form.
So, remember the Catholic monarchs, the ones who expelled the Jews back in 1492? This was their personal emblem, the yoke and arrows. It was a symbol of conquest and enforced unity. Now look at this. It's the exact same symbol, adopted 5 centuries later as the official emblem of the Spanish Fascist Party. The connection couldn't be more direct or more deliberate. The fascists explicitly celebrated the legacy of the Inquisition and the expulsion.
But with the actual Jewish population basically gone, the fascists needed a new enemy. So they invented a phantom, the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. In this paranoid worldview, a secret cabal of international Jews were the puppet masters, pulling the strings of their puppets, the Spanish Freemasons, all to destroy Catholic Spain.
And this phantom enemy had very real consequences. While there was no systematic genocide of Jews in Spain itself, the fascists murdered an estimated 3,000 Spanish Freemasons, their supposed puppets, under the pretext of this insane conspiracy theory. Franco's ideology was just bizarrely two-faced. He was obsessed with this phantom enemy, a global Judeo-Masonic conspiracy. But he somehow split Jews into 2 categories. You had the bad Jews, who were all part of this plot, and then you had the good Jews, the Sephardi. And his logic? He grotesquely claimed that their centuries of contact with Spain had somehow purified them, making them okay. It was a completely self-serving fantasy that let him be both a raging anti-Semite and a supposed protector all at the same time.
But of course, the reality on the ground was brutal and had nothing to do with this fantasy. In the early days of his military coup, Franco's own fascist stormtroopers, the Phalangists, were actively torturing and murdering the very Sephardic Jews he claimed to value. And the cruelty was horrific and deeply personal. I mean, in one well-documented case, they committed a truly Nazi-like act of humiliation, forcibly shaving a cross onto the head of a Jewish beggar. That was the reality behind all the rhetoric of protection. So what stopped the violence? Was it a change of heart? Nope. The atrocities only ended when the Jewish bankers who were, get this, financially backing Franco's coup, demanded that he stop. In the end, his money and his power trumped even his most twisted ideology. He even let the Gestapo just operate freely in Spain. You see, this was never about a coherent ideology. It was pure, cynical self-interest, plain and simple. And that pragmatism completely defined his foreign policy. For years after World War II, Franco was an international pariah. Nobody wanted anything to do with him. But then, everything changed in 1953. You can see the regime's cynicism so clearly right here. Before 1953, Franco was all in on supporting the Arab world in its war against the new state of Israel. But the moment he signed military pacts with the United States, he had to clean up his image. So what did he do? Overnight, his pro-Arab policy just vanished. He did a complete 180, embraced Israel, and launched this massive propaganda campaign to rebrand himself as a savior of the Jews. Franco took the incredible, heroic story of Ángel Sanz, a Spanish diplomat who genuinely saved thousands of Jews in Hungary during the Holocaust, and he twisted it. He forced Sanz to lie, to claim he was only following Franco's direct orders. He effectively stole the heroism of a good man just to launder his own reputation on the world stage. So this brings us to the modern era. And you might think, okay, with the arrival of democracy, this cynical game has to end, right? Well, not exactly. The ghost of Sepharad just put on new clothes. The same old patterns of political maneuvering, just adapted to the times. And it's not just a ghost in the numbers either. The old, toxic rhetoric, it's still around. I mean, get this. As recently as 2004, after those horrific train bombings in Madrid, some right-wing media outlets actually dragged out the old Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory to try and explain the attacks. It just goes to show you how sticky these ideas are, you know? How they can just lie dormant, waiting for a chance to pop back. In democratic Spain, the sources of anti-Jewish sentiment have shifted, but new forms have popped up, mainly from the communist far left and from some parts of the Muslim immigrant community. And it's often centered on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And while that old-school, overt anti-Semitism is now mostly just on the neo-Nazi fringe, the cynical politics are alive and well. You get these truly bizarre situations, like neo-Nazis calling for solidarity with Palestinian terrorists, and in maybe the strangest twist of all, the official Falange party,
the direct heirs of Franco, now hold pro-Palestinian protests using rhetoric that is identical to their historical arch-enemies, the communists. And here is the final modern twist. The Spanish far-right, which is the direct ideological heir to Franco, has pulled a similar pivot. They've pretty much dropped the old Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory. The modern far-right in Spain, just like its cousins across the West, has a whole new list of enemies. Now the threat is framed as coming from Muslim immigrants, a globalist left, progressive social policies, and secularism. And in this new clash of civilizations, a strong Israel is suddenly a very useful ally. This whole saga culminates in a final, bitter irony that just perfectly encapsulates Spain's contradictory history. Remember Almeria, the city where we found that 2nd century Jewish tombstone, a city that was a jewel of Sephardic culture and later a bastion for the liberal Freemasons that Franco hated? Well, today, it's a major stronghold for Vox, the new far-right party. And through it all, who's stuck in the middle? The Sephardic community. They continue to be the collateral damage in Spain's endless internal political games, the living witnesses to a nation that still can't seem to figure out what to do with its own history. So, from expulsion and erasure to cynical exploitation and reappropriation, the ghost of Sepharad has been this constant presence in Spain's national story. Which leaves us with a final, really haunting question. After all these centuries of games, can a nation ever truly escape its ghosts, or find peace with a past it just refuses to honestly own?